All right, let's get this party started again. So, hey, everybody, welcome back from networking. I am super excited to have George and Chris join us here. And here's why. One, Chris has been a longtime supporter of the xAPI cohort. And at conferences is always the person who scoops me up and gives me somebody to talk to, which was pretty awesome. And George recently joined RustToSee, and I always love it when good people land well. So as we start talking about SCORM, which I was in a session last week, and somebody asked me, tell me what this STORM thing is. I'm like, oh, I was going to talk about xAPI, but let's go back to this STORM or SCORM thing. We've got SCORM, there's xAPI, there's cmi5, there used to be AICC. Will you two help us sort out all of these vocabulary words and when we should be using what?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I really appreciate it. I think I've shared my screen properly so that everybody can kind of see. But today's goal is to walk through cmi5, SCORM, xAPI, all of these weird standards. What are they really? Why are they different? Why can't they be the same thing? And with me, I've brought along George, who's one of the leading experts, a new member of our team. I couldn't be more excited to have George become a part of RustToSee. And between us, we're going to do our best to make sense of all of this. So in typical fashion, I'm going to give you the normal high-level side of things, and then I've got George here to dive deep into the weeds because I know this group is technical at times and likes to sink their teeth into all of the various details. So quick agenda, we've got what is cmi5? We're also going to talk about how it bridges the gap between SCORM, a topic I've been talking about for 10 years or more at this stage. We're also going to look at the state of adoption, because as cool as these tools will be, if no one's using them, why are they useful? And then we're going to preview what's next. I am super excited about cmi5 coming in the fall, and I hope you can walk away from today's conversation fundamentally understanding why I'm so excited, because I think that we've got real tangible steps towards adoption. So about Rustici Software, who are we and why do we get to talk to this group so frequently? RustToSee is kind of behind the scenes everywhere. We only do three things at the end of the day. We know how to help teams save as one of these weird standards, SCORM, AICC, xAPI, cmi5, what have you. We know how to build the player behind the scenes in most platforms on the market. And then we have some tools that live in between those. So RustToSee has a wide mix of products depending on how technical are you really, but we're only really solving three things: save as, play, and distribute. So through those three things, we've made our way out into many, many different applications, 450 or so vendors out there, 80 or more governments, and SCORM Cloud is a platform I hope you guys use for free, but over 1,500 people pay for it every month, and we're doing some cool things in that tool as well. So what is this new standard called cmi5? Well, it turns out that pushing a new standard into the industry isn't as easy as I naively thought 10 years ago when xAPI was first starting to be conceived. There's a chicken and egg moment. Vendors who play and track things don't want to implement things if there aren't authoring tools building those packages. No one wants to go through the work of implementing how to save as these complicated things unless there's a lot of customers using platforms that are demanding it. And so getting that initial push into a new standard can be tricky and hard. So what is cmi5? cmi5 is what you're saying. xAPI is a communications protocol. It's designed to help two different e-learning tools talk to one another. cmi5 is trying to come up with what you're saying. So to use xAPI, you need a set of rules. We've heard these things called profiles. We've heard these things called recipes and registries and many other types of behaviors. But xAPI and cmi5 is more like what we see in AICC for some of those who have played with that standard. There's these assignable units known as AUs, and cmi5 is a launchable moment. I don't think xAPI could ever replace SCORM, but cmi5 might. And that's because it's designed to help facilitate a launchable thing that plays in tracks and surfaces a defined set of verbs so that an LMS or another learning platform can make sense of what's being pushed through. Things like launched, passed, failed, initialized. There's a list here on the slides as well. So talking about each of those verbs in a vacuum is kind of not as interesting. Made a chart. This is a little elementary because I'm the one talking, but here's kind of a go, no-go for some of the things that we constantly get asked. SCORM versus xAPI versus CMI5, and there's some intentional overlap here. You can see that xAPI, which was the push that we had for trying to expand some of these different capabilities within the standards, came up short when it came to like providing things that traditional LMSs and traditional training platforms expected. There was no way to play or launch or deal with a manifest or handle some of these things. And you'll notice my excitement comes in on the right-hand column with CMI5 because it's strengthening a lot of the problems that we saw in a pure xAPI environment. So this gives us a way to move data, to give a little more data portability. While SCORM provided a lot of packaging and tracking, xAPI was just sending free-form statements, and CMI5 is the best combination of these features. They address everything that we saw complaints from in the xAPI standard. SCORM is constrained to a defined set of variables. CMI5 has predefined, but it opens the door to so much more expressive type of communications. The xAPI standard also helped us reach into things like simulators and mobile apps and some of these other non-SCORMy packaged moments. But CMI5 is going to make it easier for those vendors in the mobile space. SCORM can play on mobile, but launching something that's not a package and get it into an LMS, let it track, let it report it in a standardized way, and this becomes really interesting. But I realize that I am dancing around a lot of technical weight as I talk through this and we look at green check marks and red X's. So George, I'm going to turn it over to you for a minute. George is one of the leading experts here at RustToSee when it comes to the technical bits. He's implemented these things in a lot of different platforms. And with that, George, take us beyond SCORM, beyond xAPI, and into these things in a little more technical fashion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. As a transfer moment here, some of this is going to be for instructional designers. Some of this is going to be for instructional developers. We'll do our best to bridge the conversation for both groups. Afterwards, please bring us questions. We'd love to answer anything. So when we talk about SCORM and xAPI and all of these different data standards, we're kind of talking about 4 key pieces that makes up a learning standard. How do you capture, how do you go about capturing data? How do you go about the package and import portion of the problem? What does the data model look like? And then what's the information model? Now, the information model is really the most key piece. How do we actually make meaning out of just a bunch of raw data? One of the great, excuse me. So with CMI5, right off the bat, we're telling a more interesting launch story. We're not just saying the SCORM version, you have an LMS, you have to launch from an LMS, and this is very specific and limited workflow. And xAPI didn't even have a launch story. Tin Can did, and I know we often use xAPI and Tin Can interchangeably, but Tin Can had a really weak one. xAPI never had one at all. CMI5 has this incredibly robust launch story. And it's extremely exciting that now we can launch things from everywhere. We often talk about VR and simulation, and CMI5 is going to give us a model where we can handle the problems of launching, even in those contexts, in a way that makes sense and still allows us to do things like define sessions, the user bracketed experience for a single setting. We, especially in the SCORM world, we talked about the big 4, your completion, your success status, time you were in it, any scoring related components. While SCORM had those, they had a very limited scope for them. xAPI, again, it just had some spots you could put things, but nobody interpreted them in a consistent way. CMI5 says, here's the way to interpret them in a meaningful and precise direction. We go beyond what it was just, here's the learner session and here's how we capture data around it, because now we have the ability to, we'll call it waving. There's a waving verb, we'll get into that in a minute. And the LMS gets to contribute partially, kind of in the way that SCORM 2004 did, but way more. to allowing learners to be marked as complete on things that they didn't themselves consume. The last two items here are, in my opinion, they're the most exciting because they're, as a person who does this every day, getting courses to exit from a SCORM context and go where they should go is a nightmare. CMI5 specifically thought about this problem and addresses it. So when you're leaving the course, it's not just always, we're going to bounce back into the LMS. Now you have controls that allow you to pick, like, I want to exit out to a particular URL. I want to exit back to where I started from. This is now a content author's choice, not just an LMS deployment choice. And finally, the ability in SCORM and xAPI both, when you wanted to deliver content to the remote LMS, you had to ball it all up and you had to send it over to them. There's been workarounds over the years. We happen to be familiar with a couple of those. But those workarounds, they all have their own interesting limitations. They all tell a story that's very much stapled on top of the standards. CMI5 specifically tells you, I can launch content from anywhere, and we're going to still be able to track and do the full learner experience no matter where you're running and managing that content. This makes it really easy to do things like build custom applications that deliver learning content and still have them launched from a traditional LMS experience. So with that, let's dig in a little bit to what are the specific steps in a CMI5 communication, and how do they relate to what we already know? You'll notice right off the bat, this is a very standout piece of this slide. We say CMI5 here, we say SCORM here, we don't say xAPI here, because xAPI didn't have any verbs in the standard itself. The verbs weren't defined. Now there's this things called xAPI profiles that we mentioned a bit earlier, which xAPI profiles is just a way of saying, on top of a list of a collection of xAPI statements, how do we define them so only certain things are allowed and start to give them meaning? Since xAPI itself didn't have that built in, we don't have a story around what does an LMS session look like. So in a traditional, in the CMI5 approach to spelling out the story of what a session looks like, there's two types of verbs. There's the ones that the LMS produces. These are the ones that say, these are the ones that say, we're doing a thing at the LMS level before the learner ever engages with content that brackets a session. Launched is the most obvious example. Launch tells you the LMS has done a thing, but the course is not yet reported in. You'll see that some of them are tagged L for LMS verbs, some of them are tagged A for AU verbs, verbs generated by the content. We haven't defined AU and block. I'm going to be very explicit about that right here. An AU is just like a SCO and SCORM. It's the smallest launchable piece of content within the setting. Whereas a block is just a container of AUs. We can build up blocks of AUs and build kind of like a whole tree of knowledge in the CMI5 manifest. So these A verbs on a per AU basis, they look a lot like the original SCORM sessions looked. You initialized, the learner takes the training, and then they get passed, they get completed, they get failed. And then there is a moment where you're supposed to close out the session. We're no longer communicating here, the terminate. And just like in SCORM, you had initialize, you had set value, you had terminate. We have verbs that kind of match that experience and places in the xAPI statements to track these elements. But at the end, we have all these extra verbs that the LMS can provide that tells you more about the story. Waived and satisfied in particular are ways for the LMS to record a permanent record that the AU or the block that's being used by this course, it's been achieved. We'll call it successfully exited. And then there's satisfied, which tells you that it's been achieved and completed in a way that the LMS should say, this is now something you can move on from. So there's exit behaviors, there's termination behaviors, and then there's completion behaviors. The LMS does a lot more heavy lifting with CMI5 than it ever did with SCORM because it brackets a larger piece of the experience. And now we got these base things. How do we bring them all together?
Yeah, so I'm going to bubble it up here for a second. We're going to pull our heads out of the code and just say, look, CMI5 is specifically designed for the LMS use case. xAPI can connect a lot of cool data. You can be very expressive. There's a right time to use it. I call it screwdrivers, sockets, and wrenches. You guys have probably heard me do this before. Use the right tool for the right job. They're all very similar, but they have a specific utility. CMI5 is going to help us connect something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end for the most part to an LMS, so the LMS can tell that content, hey, here's the person doing it, and that content can stream and play the way it needs to, and then tell the LMS, hey, here's how they did. That's a common trade-off that has to happen. It's an exchange of data that's really necessary for this place, and CMI5 is that glue that holds it together. xAPI is flexible, and that's a really powerful thing, but without the consistency, you don't get the ability to build something once that can plug into every system. That's a very important moment, and it's the thing that vendors want in this space, and that you, or who are building a course, want to do the work a single time and have it connect to any system the same way every time. That consistency, that predictability is the way that we get the economies of scale that these standards are designed to provide to the industry. CMI5 wants to be plug and play, and I think it can be. And that's an important moment for the industry. And the thing that I think will allow this to really catapult itself into something that everybody uses, because it's going to be a little more plug and play than xAPI on its own ever was. It's going to give us the strength that we saw in SCORM, but with the modern flexibility that these standards are going to require. So, George, now that we kind of know the fit for purpose, the reason we use this tool, let's walk through a workflow together, and I'm going to let you do that so that we don't stumble around.
No problem. So instructional designers, this is really your moment of what it's going to look like as various content tools are actually bringing in CMI5 adapters and you're publishing to CMI5. So this is the story of what life will play like moving forward. Right off the bat, you're going to author content, hopefully with all of the traditional tools that you use to author content right now. And instead, you'll press your Publish to CMI5 button, just like you press Publish to SCORM or xAPI today. And you'll end up with a package, a zip package that looks just like all of the things that you already get when you do a SCORM or xAPI publish. No, nothing unusual or unique there. So at that point, you'll bring it to your LMS administrator. Most of you are probably also your LMS administrator in at least some part. And so you'll get it uploaded into the LMS. You'll get the learner enrolled. This is, while CMI5 works outside the LMS, it does solve some real problems for what's the story of interacting with content outside the LMS. It is still a purpose-built for the LMS first approach to the standard, the learning standards. So you get your learner enrolled. Then there's some mechanics around what the LMS does in order to configure, based on that CMI5 manifest, the launch experience that the LMS will do. So if we'll move on to the next step, the learner will first, from the learner, they launch learning. The AU has a whole bunch of rules that you will never directly have to touch about how to get the launch to go off. There's this great launch workflow around a thing called the fetch URL that every library that handles CMI5 is going to do the work for you. You don't really need to dig into it. Just know that we've got, unlike xAPI, we've got this really strong and solid way to launch each AU that gives us a nice trackable moment for what defines the session. Then the AU interacts with the LRS. We get all the statements that configure the experience, such as that launch verb that we showed you earlier. And then that's it. You're in a piece of training, just like your Articulate Rises or your Adobe Captivates and such put out. User interacts with it. They generate xAPI statements. They generate xAPI states. You're still sending all of these statements to the LRS. It's just like you're interacting with a xAPI-ish launched by Tin Can piece of content now with a lot more definition. So when that completion moment occurs, you're going to get a lot more, the LMS is going to know what to do with it in a much more explicit way. So I've said xAPI statements multiple times in here. They're actually called CMI5 statements. Let me show you why that's different. What's important about that? There's really two types of CMI5 statements when it comes to xAPI. You're going to hear the phrase CMI5 defined, and CMI5 allowed. Defined are the ones that use, one, those verbs that we've talked about, the AU side verbs, those initialized, those terminated from the AU perspective, and then potentially passed, failed, completed. They also have a lot of other rules in defined that lock it in saying, LMS, this is a very specific instruction I want you to execute something on. You can also do CMI5 allowed, which is just a way to tag the statement that says, this is part of the session, but I don't want you to think about it, LMS. Do no logic against this CMI5 allowed statement. Just store it in the bucket of xAPI statements we're storing. But so an interesting little quirk of that is that you can have a past CMI5 allowed statement and a past CMI5 defined statement. It's very, very important to know which one you're making because it completely changes how the LMS interacts with your system. So the things that are important about CMI5 statements that are that break away from what xAPI assumed. IDs and timestamps are required. You used to be able to just assume them, the LMS would fill them in. Now you have to provide them as the AU. The LMS is always going to provide you with an actor. So this is not a case where you can say, I've got the main actor, but I've got a bunch of different groups that can also generate learning. This is the learner session for that learner, just like it was in SCORM. When you created data, you were creating it for one person, one entity, whatever it may be you're tracking, and it's only for that entity during the life of the session. The result object in the statement, we're going to get into that specifically in a little bit, is extremely interesting in CMI5. It adds a bunch of meaning that is just like how SCORM provided a data model for capturing completion and such. The result object has it, and it has rules and meaning. And one of the nice parts is that the CMI5 group didn't push on the xAPI folks to add to the standard to make CMI5 fit. CMI5 uses xAPI extensions intentionally. So we're starting to see the flexibility of the xAPI data model allow us to go way beyond what SCORM did for purpose-built things like CMI5. So I was really excited about the CMI5 results thing. Let's get into why, because this is the part. Telling the reporting story around learning is hard at the best of times. You've gone to your LMS, whether it was SCORM or xAPI, you've tried to get the learner completion reports, you've tried to get the scores. And if you use more than one LMS, it's most likely that you got different results for those types of reports. There's a lot of inconsistency because SCORM provided a great data model, but only a so-so information model. xAPI provided a really good data model and a non-existent information model. CMI5 takes the best of both worlds. So we can have both this extremely flexible data model, but we layer on that xAPI profile to tell us all about all the great things that we can actually capture in an extremely precise way. The first thing you're going to notice about this slide is we got the word may and must slapped all over it. I apologize in advance. This is standard terminology, as in the CMI5 standards. These words are extremely important in what things mean. Must is a hard word. It's a, if this statement has to have this value provided in this spot if you match it with this verb. Whereas may says, if you'd like to put it in there, it's great. We'll make it available to the LRS and the LMS to do things with. And then the red X, it means it's called a must not. You absolutely cannot put it in the statement. So you can see that we have a lot of very tight control over exactly what goes in this result block that's here on the right and the highlighted. This is an xAPI statement where we trimmed out all of the stuff that's not critical for the purpose of this slide. So you've got results, scores, scaled raw min max, just like SCORM 2004. A lot of stuff carried forward in this result block from what you know about SCORM. There's a success field, there's a completion field. Completion's not in here because I'm using a past verb. And if we look at the chart, if you're using a past verb, you're not allowed to have the completion field. So I kept myself honest, even though it meant I couldn't show you the completion field in this slide. And then a duration, which is just how much time has passed in whatever that means to you, the course author, as of the point we generated this piece of data. So again, you see the verb workflow on the left. You see which ones are generated by the LMS and which ones are generated by the AU. And you see that both the LMS and the AU at times get to use these result fields, whether it's success, the past or failed situation. Past has to have a true success. Failed has to have a false success. So by the time you break these verbs down, you can tell exactly the story around the big four. As we said earlier, user completion, user satisfaction, and time spent in the activity, and scoring of whatever that means to you for the learner in this extremely precise way that everybody has to use mostly the same way. So that's going to be a really big step forward for every system to implement CMI5. Reporting should be a much, much better situation in the long run. All right, so we looked at one little block of this statement. Let's get a better look at the whole thing. What changes in CMI5 in an xAPI statement? Again, Instructional designers, your authoring tools will probably do this for you. Instructional developers, here's your heavy lift. Here's the pieces that you're going to have to be sensitive to if you're going to try to move from xAPI to CMI5. I talked about the ID and timestamp. Those, you have to have it for every CMI5 statement, whether it's defined or whether it's allowed. The registration. So registration is a super important word. Think about when you enroll a student in a course. In most of our products here, we call that a registration. In CMI5, that student matched into a course is their registration forevermore. They will always carry that same registration along. But if you look down towards the bottom of the slide where it's in the extensions, there's a session ID there with a number. The session ID is the launchable moment for that student taking one element of training, the time they sat from the launch till they closed their browser window or pressed the exit button. And so we've got a way to bracket, here's all the data the learner generated around an enrollment, and here's the data generated for each sitting that the student went through. SCORM didn't have a nice way to do attempts. It had the theory of attempts, but it was a disaster and nobody implemented it correctly. CMI at xAPI doesn't have, it has a registration that people hope you would use, but has no concept of a session whatsoever. So CMI5 enforces the premise of an attempt, and there's absolutely no way in the standard to avoid supporting this. It's a really big step forward for getting good learnable data across this. You'll notice in the middle, there's this thing called the context activities. The CMI5 defined statements, where it just marks it there as a category of CMI5, that's just so the LRS knows this is an actual CMI5 defined statement. So if you use a verb that CMI5 defined would know what to do with, then this is the instruction that says actually do that thing with it. And the grouping is just a nice way to pull together all of my content is attached to this activity. And you can use different groupings based on the level you are within your course. So at the top level, there's a course, there's blocks, and they contain AUs, just like that SCORM navigation tree full of SCOs. This grouping is required so that you have a way to group all of that data together. All right. That's it. You know everything there is to know about CMI5 right now. You're complete experts, but that is just the starting point. We have an ecosystem of raw technology and standards that tell you the basic story of how we can make reporting and learner interactions and everything better. Who's using it today, Chris?
Yeah, good ecosystem question. Womp womp. 6 and 6. I love all 6 that are using it, both on the authoring tool side and on the LMS side. I think there's probably more in reality, but these are all of the ones that have gone through the official CMI5 adopters process according to the CMI5 working group. This number will grow over time, and I'm actually going to look forward to reflecting back on these slides years from now when it's far out of my brain and go, wow, we moved from 6 to lots. So these things move at glacial speeds. George and I have been in this industry over 10 years apiece, and I've seen the rise and fall of many different e-learning standards, but they do move. And I think that especially with ADL's backing, with the way this industry is adopting things, with the way that RustToSee helps people save as, play, and distribute, we're going to be pushing the industry into this new way pretty rapidly once there are some defined ways to prove adoption and to make this a lot easier. So we're at the start, but this is a good start. And the 6 on each side that have chose to participate in this, I applaud them. They're right out in front, but they're using the right tools for the right reasons. They're not just anchoring themselves to a buzzword. They're implementing tools that help people. And I think that this is a really, really good start. So you'll notice the right side, who's passed the test? No one yet, because the test is on its way. So in order to make this list grow, we need ways to help people adopt these things more rapidly, to get a source of truth, to know that these tools are what they are, that are proven out, and that have some type of measurement. And I would like to welcome everyone to Project CATAPULT. This is headed up by ADL, the group that is ultimately the keepers of the SCORM AICC, xAPI, and now CMI5 standards. They are the patron saint of all of us here, and ADL is pumping a ton of really excellent work into this. Catapult is actually an acronym, the cmi5 Advanced Testing Application Player Underpinning Learning Technologies, Catapult. The military, the Department of Defense at large really likes acronyms, as do I. So this is a good one for me, but I think it is a representation of we need to fling this into production. And Project Catapult is really designed to do just that. So there's a lot of effort going on. RustToSee is super involved in Project Catapult, and we have the goals to release a few things in the fall. These few things are really going to help us make sure that the industry is adopting these in the right ways. So we've got a prototype for a CMI5 player that will be released. People can use it to go and play CMI5 content. There's going to be a test suite, 2 of them to be in fact. One will be on the content creator side to make sure that these packages, these CMI5 launchable thingies, can actually play the way that we all think that they should play. There will also be a test suite for the players themselves so that we have a Faxer-friendly moment. Is your player handling CMI5 the way that it should be? This gives a better way for us to say, okay, here's where things are going wrong. We are also going to put out a library of sample content as a part of this project so that there's some benchmarking courses. That's always a fun Faxer-friendly moment. Does this thing work the way it should? You don't know unless we've got some common ground to stand on. And then finally, a ton of guides and documentation to help implementing these things on your own become more rapidly developable. Implemented is probably a better word. We want people to have guides so that this isn't this mysterious, strange environment that you're getting dropped into. Let's give people the things that they need to be successful and to have Faxer-friendly moments. Player testers, content testers, documentation, benchmarking examples, those are all coming in the fall. So I think moving from the list of 6 and 6 that is here, these are the early adopters and I applaud them. Project Catapult is really going to take us into getting people where they need to be in order to be successful there. As we go through that, then we need to kind of understand the expected outcomes of Project Catapult. So again, it's designed to accelerate adoption. It's going to start with the Department of Defense at large. They're the ones funding the projects, but guys, we've seen this over and over in the SCORM, AICC, xAPI space. The things ADL does within the DoD make their way into nearly every business vertical organizational tool that I've seen. This is a well-worn path, and I think that we're really getting the maturity we need around this standard. It's going to help us gain adoption, and these tools are going to ensure that stakeholders are able to procure and implement things. Some of you have even heard me talk about RFPs and how hard xAPI can be to put in there. CMI5 directly addresses a lot of those things. It helps eliminate a lot of the ambiguous nature of trying to work inside these standards. It also gives us ways to validate existing products and tools, to provide ways to give a vendor a sample package and see it work across all vendors at the same time. Project Catapult is not only aimed at solving a lot of technical issues, but it also helps clarify a lot of procurement and business challenges so that teams can make sure they're buying things that work for them without getting surprised on the other side, which is something we've seen. So when we really get into that, George, I think we've got kind of a little example of this workflow in a video form. I'm going to go ahead and move into it, and I think you're going to do a little narration here.
Absolutely. All right, welcome to Catapult. This is the CMI5 conformance test suite for LMSs and content. So right off the bat, authentication, you've either credentialed or cookie-based, will get you right in. On this homepage, you'll have a list of courses that are searchable or filterable, and they'll contain the various packages or content structures you want to test. So to make a new course for testing, we'll press that new course button. We'll be given the option to either upload a course package or provide a course structure directly, cmi5.xml. Here's a simple course structure. We directly paste it in, and then we import and are in the course structure view. You can see details about the course itself. You can see the IDs, the titles, both at the block level and at the AU level. If I want to do a more complicated course, it's still new course, same workflow. We take this much more complicated manifest. It's a multi-AU course. It's got a bunch of blocks controlling the structure. As we look through here, you'll see that the items in this have titles and descriptions in multiple languages. It probably looks a lot like a SCORM navigation tree because it's effectively equivalent to a SCORM navigation tree. AUs and SCOs are kind of the same thing. From here, we'll start a test. You'll have to get an actor going first. We love this randomize button. We put in a bunch of crazy great names. If you need to do something specific for long-term tracking, put your own explicit actors in there. That's fine. From there, the main testing view will give you the AUs you can launch. We're going to pick this AU. We're going to configure it a bit. We're going to choose what the launch method is. Is it a pop-up? Is it a new window? Course in this case, we use the course structure. We can put in mastery score to change the satisfaction rules. Once we launch it, and it starts the actual course just like you're playing it in a traditional LMS, you'll see on the right-hand side the CMI5 and xAPI events that are occurring. The tester is going to interact with the course. It's going to generate statements, and then for instance, the interactions from this quiz. Our tester is a genius and gets through this with 100, which is great. You'll see the completion events there. You'll also see, as they get to the exit here, that we capture all the information around the return. This allows us to even test the exit behavior on the course. Again, one of the problems that SCORM was really rough with. So now let's go into that more complicated test. Again, select our actor, and we've got all of these assignable units that are launchable. So you get the same experience testing each one uniquely. And there we go. Once we're all done, we delete it. We can now go into do a new import. And this import, we're going to actually upload a content package. And uploading that zip file, that CMI5 content package, gives you the same experience as if you were doing it from just pasting CMI5 XML in directly. So there you go. This gives you all the tools you need to fully validate your material. Once we have a test suite in the world, it's going to make adoption that much easier for LMSs. And then you can point to the LMS and say, if my content works here, the LMS can play it anywhere. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Yeah, thank you. I made it really mad at me. Come on, go back. There we go. All right. What's next? George went through that really fast, and then we made a video of it and sped it up. So we're happy to slow down. If you have questions about that workflow, please feel free to get involved with the CMI5 working group. Reach out to us. We'll slow it down and do it with you live as well. That's cool. Facts are friendly. We want everybody to be a part of that group and to make sure that they're using those tools in the right way. What's next? We got to get people to adopt CMI5. That's just the next step to making these things work. A lot of really smart people, far smarter than me, are putting way more effort into the technical bits of making CMI5 something useful. But you've got to have tools that support it in order for us normal humans to deliver training, to build things, to measure things, to deliver things. No one gets excited about these standards. People should get excited about the things that these standards enable. So we're going to need everyone in the e-learning space to assess whether CMI5 is the right tool for the job. A screwdriver, a socket, and a wrench all fit a threaded bolt, but one is going to be way easier to use than another depending on the situation you find yourself in. CMI5 is the same way. Assess whether this is the right tool for the job for your team. Start by having open conversations on where CMI5 fits in your ecosystem. This is now a new tool in the toolbox. You don't need to use it every time for every situation, but it's really handy when you need to have these type of remote or advanced content tracking types. Finally, you've got to go find tools that have this in their toolbox. If you're not willing, and no one should be writing these things by hand every time, go invest in tools that have adopted this standard. I promise they're the ones paying attention to the market right now. I promise they're the ones trying to go out and do advanced new things and to solve complicated problems. And if they don't have CMI5 today, you should ask if it's on their roadmap. And if it's not, they're probably not paying attention to the way that these standards move. That's a really key indicator from where I sit of what is the roadmap like for these products and how long is this tool going to be useful in your toolbox. Ask Ask vendors, use those benchmarking courses, use those tools that are going to come out as a part of Project Catapult to get to that FAXR-friendly moment of not only do they claim support, but it works and it tracks and plays and launches the way that you need it to. That's an important distinction and something that I hope procurement teams, the business side of folks, will have the opportunity to take advantage of. I also encourage everyone on this call to follow along with Project Catapult. It's a really interesting group, especially for those of you more on the technical side of things. You can join the upcoming webinars. You can follow along at xapi.com. We're hyping that up and trying to keep people engaged. Not all of you probably want to get into the weeds, but we will be providing summaries and plain English guides. That's a part of what I do every day to help you go, okay, all of this weird stuff's out there. What does this actually mean for me? And we're here to make sure that that's translated into different technical levels for every persona that might be interested in some of these CMI5 things. If you're interested in working on the spec itself, it's open. You can join those working groups. You can begin to contribute. I promise people on this call have unique circumstances, unique corner cases, unique little rabbit holes, and we want to hear about it. The working groups need to understand the edges of where this spec breaks down in order for us to build something here while we have the opportunity, because once this ship leaves the harbor, changing it can be really difficult. So if you're passionate about these type of things, if you have technical contributions to make, the door is wide open, and I would love to see more people get involved. So you're probably thinking, well, how do I do that? Here's a handy list of resources. These are the links you need to go deeper, to dive deeper. George and I have a policy of ask us anything, really. You can email info@xAPI or SCORM or RustToSeeSoftware.com, and we'll answer your questions. We're always happy to dive in deeper. No hard sales pressure from our side. We really understand this stuff well, and I think it's a rising tide that raises all ships. The more people using these standards, the more interoperable the world becomes, and the easier instructional designers, learning and training organizations can be with the way that they want to deliver content, see what's going on, measure outcomes, track compliance. All of those things are hyper important. And CMI5 is just a tool to enable those things. So be sure to take advantage. And if you want to go deeper, you certainly can. So along those lines, my last slide is always ask us anything. That's what we're here to do. I believe we have a little time, and I know I've seen the live chat handle a lot of questions and answers, and we will certainly be hanging around after this. I've seen some really good questions here pop up that Tara's helping me bring to the surface, but I am conscious of the time, so maybe that's a breakout room type of moment as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and George. That was fantastic. And I wonder if you could drop your email also in the chat. So in case people haven't screenshotted this, they can be in touch. Chris and George will be available at table 1 for this next networking bit. So feel free to ask them, like they said, any other questions there. At table 2 for the theme networking, Peter Gunther will be there for xAPI jobs and career networking. And as always, you are free to mingle around at other tables, the speed networking area. Go grab that afternoon cup of coffee, and our next session is going to start at the top of the hour. So thank you, everybody.